one thing that kind of irks me when it comes to the gym is the difference between is SLDLs and RDLs, and it's something where for ages now has been a clear problem where you watch videos and there's inconsistent definitions of both and you don't really know which one it is, and then you almost have to create your own definition. So I think we're gonna settle it. Okay, we're gonna settle it. This is gonna be about what I think we should have as the terminology for SLDL and RDLs. And look, if we go back in time and we look at the original RDLs, the Romanian deadlift, the way it was performed is completely different to today. Like, you can go onto YouTube, you can look that up, and you'll see something absolutely insane. I even wrote a newsletter all about this and how it's evolved and changed, because it's just interesting, really, like seeing the history of how things change throughout history. That's a really boring way to put it. But yeah, it's just interesting to see how this field has evolved and how we've changed things that used to be a certain way and they've become something else, but we still have the same name attached to it and the same sort of origin that's in people's heads. But the SLDL and the RDL is a really annoying one, to be honest, because there's movements like the bench press and the deadlift and the squat where they kind of aren't movements. They're just ways to describe something going from point A to point B with like a couple checklists, right? Deadlift is starts on the floor, lockout. That's basically the stuff involved. But there's not many rules. Like, of course, there's some obscure rules and there's but you know, that's basically what we can call it. Squat is bar on back, hip crease below knee crease, come back up. That's a squat. Bench press is bar touches chest, bar comes up, and you know, the grip width, and that's like the silly things that doesn't really matter, right? There are other things involved, but they're so small. But this means all of these movements have many different ways in which you can perform it. So a bench press is never the same as blah and blah and blah, and this kind of goes for everything. Like, many things don't really have a universal way to perform, they just have a couple checklists. But SLDLs and RDLs are a little bit different. The reason I say this is because what's occurring in them is really just at the hips and the knees, and that's why I think the way in which I describe the difference between the two is interesting, because SLDLs and RDLs are really just one motion, right? I think that makes sense. We're extending the hip with load, and we're holding something in front of us. Similar to the bench press, okay? Not in the sense of a press, but a bench press is only really one thing. We're pushing. A squat isn't really one thing because there's a lot more involved. A deadlift isn't really one thing because half the time a deadlift begins similar to like a leg extension. I guess leg extension, where you're mainly doing something like a leg press. You're not doing a pure hip hinge. So these are hinges. And if we have two hinges, we need to pick something that clearly differentiates the two. Now, the problem, which I think has been heavily rooted in the way personal trainers are trained, the way exercise form is trained, the way textbooks show exercises, is we'd like to have the beautiful, perfect one-size-fits-all for any exercise. If you see a bench press, they'll do it a certain way, and it will basically be said, this is the way to do it. But then we know that there's many different ways to do it, especially based on your unique body in order to get the most weight coming up. Same with a squat. We can change the position of the bar from high to low to super French low, and that's going to make a difference, especially if we're someone with longer femurs, for instance. With the deadlift, we can have people doing it with straight back, with rounded upper back. We can have people doing it sumo, and that is all still a deadlift. Even if, I guess, if we sat there and wrote down like a long paragraph describing everything going on, we could call them all different things. But when you have that textbook, they show a certain way, and you're almost teaching someone that that's the way it works, because we're not giving it an arbitrary this is how an exercise works. We're just saying this is what it basically looks like on most people. Now, the way in which they teach the RDL is basically hinging with the bar so that it basically goes slightly below the knee, like 3/4 up the shin. That's how they teach that. Yeah. If you go a little bit more advanced, if you dig a little bit deeper into things that aren't just like a textbook form, people talk about staying in the active range. They'll talk about going back until your butt can no longer go back. Otherwise, it's really just your lower back rounding to get that extra bit of range. And someone's figure, their anthropometry, is going to change how low that is. You've seen people who can go super, super deep, maybe even past the floor, and they still can keep that butt going back just because that's how they are built. Now, the way they teach SLDLs, stiff leg deadlifts, is tapping off the ground. Touching the floor, touching the floor, touching the floor. But then they don't really say anything else. And this doesn't make sense. Like, it makes zero sense if we actually wanted to take away from this and we wanted to use this as something to have an outcome in our training. Because exercise variations like this, they exist for a certain reason. They're not competition lifts. So unless we're competitively doing SLDLs or RDLs, it doesn't matter if there's a textbook form. It just matters if we're able to get something out of it which gives us the outcome we're looking for. So for instance, if I was doing dumbbell bench, I just need to know, am I doing this for bigger chest, bigger pecs, or am I doing this for a bench press? Or do I just like the movement and I want to get strong on it, because that's also okay. But for the most part, there's more important things outside of the actual exercise, right? The exercise is just a way to drive to an outcome. And so with SLDLs and RDLs, we can't use this. We can't use this 3/4 of the shin or tapping off the ground, because it doesn't actually make sense. Like, what is the bigger picture stuff? What are we getting? And so this is why I think it's important for someone like me or you to go out there and really think about how we can define these movements, how we can say it exists. And it just so happens that because they are so similar and because people's bodies are so different, it doesn't make sense to have it mean anything to do with the range of motion. It needs to be about the motion itself. You know, if we were going to compare, what could we compare here? If we were going to compare a flat press with an incline press, it'd be like, boom, okay, we're doing this so that we can get more upper chest, more shoulders. So we need to have something similar here. Now, we don't need to have something similar because of the flat versus incline press, but we do need to have something similar where we're targeting sort of strength in some areas or muscle growth in some areas, and that's the reason why there's a difference. Because otherwise, it doesn't make sense. This isn't a competition lift. It just doesn't make sense, right? So, at the end of the day, what I put together, which I feel is the best way to describe the two of these, is the RDLs are something which are more of a glute focus, and so as you're performing the movement, you're having more knee bend, knee flexion, or whatever you want to call it. So it's kind of something where you're kind of going down, you're kind of flexing at the knee throughout the movement, and this targets the glutes more because the hamstrings are shortening as you're going down. Maybe not in a way that completely takes the hamstrings out of the equation, but it does reduce their involvement. So we're able to have that target the glutes more. And then for SLDLs, it's not about touching the floor. It's about having a soft lock in the knees. So if there's a little bit of bend, a tiny bit of bend, that's fine. You know, it happens. But the SLDLs are all about getting that hamstring, getting the adductor, and we're just stopping when we can't move anymore. So it's the same. You end the same way with an SLDL and an RDL, not positioning, but the reasoning. So you both stop because you can't put your butt back anymore. And when you can't put your butt back anymore, we're not turning it into a lower back exercise. You know, we're not doing a Jefferson curls. We don't want this to be for the erectors. We're doing this for the glutes or for the hamstrings and adductors, although both are going to hit adductors pretty well. But now we have a really easy way to differentiate the two. And it also means it's not about touching the floor. It's not about going slightly past the knee. If we need to stand on a block because we can't get deep enough and we can still keep sending our butt back, we do it. If we stop really, really low, and then in time, as we get more mobile, as we are able to be stronger in certain ranges, and our body trusts us to have, you know, it be a bit more lengthened in certain muscles, the range of motion might change, and that's completely fine. But we're not having any other way of defining it. At least there's no clear way I can see. So I don't know. I believe this to be one of the best ways to describe it, and I hope you can see something similar. If you like this video, feel free to subscribe. Feel free to check out my newsletter. Thanks for letting me ramble on for a bit.